How y'all doing? For those of us who read fantasy, particularly old pulp adventure stories of sword and sorcery, heroic fantasy, whatever you want to call it, the general stereotype of the hero of that usually is a fighter, particularly a barbarian, an uncivilized, strong man there who conquers all that's in front of him. There's a reason for that, of course, because of the guy who started it, Robert Howard, created the Conan series. And after his stories were published in the 30s there, he really took off in the 60s when L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter republished the books with famous Frank Frazetta art, and not only republished the original Howard stories, they wrote their own stories to go in between them and afterwards, is not only to extend it and get, more for their buck out of it, and it also creates a beginning, middle, and end for Conan to make them all coherent, all the sort of reasons, love or hate it, that's where we're at, that's how Conan has been relevant today, thanks to that bridge and that gap of time, but I digress. Now, many writers went on to the same genre and created their own unique characters that stand out differently from Conan. Of course, Fafhrd and Grey Mouser by Fritz Leiber, Michael Moorcock's Elric, Kari Wagner's Cain, Michael Shee's Niftalim, what have you. However, to maintain the masses, you find a common denominator and to make the most money, and one way to do that is basically make a derivative of the original character Conan. Clonan, as some people call it today on the internet. We're going to go through one of them. A series of 5 books by Gardner F, and that is the Kothar series. Now, these books were written between 1969 and 1970. 5 books within that time? Sure, provided you're not doing it 800 pages, putting all the useless detail on it. This is a time where you could tell a book in less than 200 pages. In this case, each book is 150 pages each. And it just goes to show the art of writing is just telling a complete story in whatever length you choose to write it in. Can he pull it off? Let's find out. The first book of the series is simply called Kothar, Barbarian Swordsman. On a side note, every time I try to run this title, even in my head, I keep wanting to call it Barbarian Sword Person because of this book, Maureen Birnbaum, A Barbarian Sword Person by George Alec Effinger, which I reviewed a few years ago. Now, thanks to that, I can't even look at this without accidentally calling it that. I even did it a few times trying to record this particular scene. But I digress. Okay, with that said, here we'll go with the first book, and we are told through an introduction that it's written by a guy who's a PhD, and it talks about the need for heroes and how they're made larger in life and all that. Here's the thing, that little introduction here, written by that PhD, he doesn't exist. It's a fake little introduction here, it's kind of neat. But with that said, we're introduce the next couple pages where it talks about the world. The world of Kothar is millions and millions of years in the future. This is our world. And regardless of whatever heights mankind went technologically, it is now back to a fantasy barbaric state where magic exists and all that. In fact, some of the old technology, whatever found, is considered a form of magic. So again, we've heard this story many times in many different books. So that's where this story is. The book has 3 separate stories. The first one is The Sword and the Sorcerer. We're introduced to Kothar, and he's on the run from a group of enemy forces after a loss of a battle. You see, Kothar at this part is a mercenary, works for Queen Alpha. She's at war with Lord Markoth. Now, Markoth is winning the war against Alpha through the help of Red Lori, who is a beautiful red-haired sorceress, and she's giving him the advantage over Queen Alpha. While on the run, Kothar finds himself in a cave, and the cave is a tomb to a very powerful ancient lich. He's not evil, don't worry about that. But, the lich is named Afgorkin. After, Kothar and Afgorkin talk about the situation, Afgorkin gives him an enchanted blade, Frostfire. Now, this sword will be a great help to Kothar throughout the series. It comes with one caveat, though. It has a geese on it that says whoever possesses this blade, the possessor cannot have any wealth, upon him. Whatever he gains, he will quickly lose. So that's the trade-off. He keeps a sword that will help him out in his adventures, but in turn, he will not have any wealth for any real length of time. So with that said, this will help him, to defeat Lord Markoth. After he leaves, he finds Queen Alpha, and she sends him to find a wizard, Kazazel. By finding this wizard, he can, combat, Red Lori, and in so doing can help defeat Lord Markoth. And I'm going to leave it like that to keep the details, give away too much of them. Then we're on to the next story. The second story is called The Treasure in the Labyrinth, where Kothar is hired by a merchant to find his treasure inside a castle. This castle is a very complex labyrinth with all sorts of traps and monsters inside. We find out more what who created the castle, what the treasure is, and is it worth Kothar going in there to retrieve it for his merchant. The third story is The Woman in the Witchwood, where Kothar, trying to find mercenary work, ends up in a land where he meets a woman who lives in a very dark tower alone. Don't worry, she's not an ugly witch. She's actually quite attractive, to where, her name is Elaine. And she tells him that she was the ruler of this land, but Lord Gorfroy has now bound her magically into the tower and the small surrounding land. She cannot leave. She wants to gain her land back, but the only way she could do is to retrieve a little bit of her hair that was taken from her, by Lord Gorfroy, and that bound her to her in her isolated state. And of course, Kothar agrees. He goes out there, he visits a small town, and he talks to the people there, find out more what he can about the area, and eventually goes to the fortress of the Lord here, and he goes through the obstacles to retrieve her hair. Is it as simple as that? Usually, no. You know what it is. You may find out that there's more to the story than what she's telling you. But I'm going to give it away here. And that's the first book, Kothar, Barbarian Swordsman. The second book in the series is Kothar and the Magic Sword, which has 2 stories of it. I'll go briefly over them. The first one is The Helix from Beyond, where Kothar is hired by a man to steal this helix as it possessed by a man who has this huge party on a boat and all that. Sounds like a simple thieving job, but it isn't. The helix, of course, has magical abilities, and Kothar finds out what they are. He eventually loses Frostfire, and he has to go through an adventure to try and get that back while trying to steal the helix from the possessor here. So now we'll go on to the next story here, which is A Plague of Demons. Now, throughout this time, through Kothar's adventures, Red Lori, the sorceress from the first story, who's captured by Queen Alpha in a silver cage, she doesn't have much power, except the power to present herself as images of some form or fashion to Kothar, to taunt him, to threaten him, now how she will get back at him for what, defeating her the first time, and, she eventually finds a way. Kothar meets up an old friend, an old merchant friend of his, to gain supplies. He has a young daughter, not a lover. He thinks of her as a sister. Unfortunately, she's possessed by a demon, and this demon this demon that's possessing her was sent to her by Red Lori, and is using her as collateral to have Kothar go and release Red Lori. So and if he does so, she'll release the demon from him. And so, how will Kothar do this? Will the demon help him out if he convinces the demon enough? Will Red Lori keep his word? How will he escape her? Well, I'll let you figure that out. Here we're on to the 4th book now. That is Kothar and the Conjurer's Curse. And this one, to give a brief synopsis of that, Kothar rescues a young girl named Stefania. But afterwards, he meets across another wizard here who charges him to deliver this amulet to Heracon, the regent of Fakar. Okay, here's the problem. The regent, who's supposed to be the ruler of the area, is now imprisoned in his own castle. So who's ruling the castle other than the regent? Will he deliver this amulet, and what will he do if he did deliver it? And he'll start learning the situation about Fakar and why it's in the state it is, and who truly is the real ruler of that land. In the final book, Kothar and the Wizard Slayer, someone is going around the world killing all the known wizards, and there's few of them left. Kothar is now teamed up with Red Lori one more time to try and find out who this killer is and find a way to stop him. What will happen? Can they stop him? And what will happen between him and Red Lori, who were enemies at the time, and can it be resolved? So that is a brief synopsis of each of the stories in the Kothar series. Is it good? Well, I enjoyed it, but it's not up there with, on the top tier of the stories of this genre. As some people call it, this is a Conan series. And is it bad for that? Well, as long as you understand what it is up front, you can enjoy what it is, even though it's a derivative of Conan. And in fact, Gary Gygax, in his famous Appendix N of suggested reading to give you an understanding of what type of adventures you play in Dungeons & Dragons, this, and Gardner Fox's other series, Kyrex, is one of them. In fact, For those of you who read the old D&D modules and all that, and what your characters go through in old D&D and other role-playing games, probably like Hyperborea, I got, Black Sword Hack Ultimate Chaos Edition, which is a game that plays off old pulp novels like this. It's not mentioned in its appendix here, but it probably would have if they were aware of it. But with that said, in the first book, which is like all the other books, there's 150 pages. The first story, a third of it, 50 pages, you read how Kothar, is escaping from a losing battle. He finds a cave, he gets the sword, and afterwards he finds the queen, who sends him out to find this wizard, and the wizard sends him off to do this. He comes back and says, okay, we need to face Red Lori, and with the help of his sword, he fights off the obstacles that Red Lori has for him. And again, you read all about this, and you look at old D&D modules and how and the way players used to play. This mimics it. In fact, something I came to realize that with D&D was trying to have players in the fantasy adventure in the vein of this, and Conan and Elric and all them, where instead of reading about the adventures of people, you create a character and have adventures of their own. Will they live? Will they die? Will they go? What will happen if they go through similar obstacles, or not the same obstacles that the characters in these books did? Nowadays, we're kind of producing books on the opposite. Was it lit RPG books, where we're writing books that are modeled on how people play the game, as opposed to people writing the books that you make a game on how to play it. We've kind of done the opposite, if you get what I'm meaning here. Where old D&D, we just use the simple game mechanics. Not simple, there could be simple or complex, but the idea is you create a character and you go on adventures there and you use the mechanics to see where they succeed or fail. Nowadays, we're trying to make RPG books, books that are modeled off how people play, tabletop role-playing games. I think we're going the opposite of that. And of course, Dungeons & Dragons, has produced their own novels of characters set in the worlds that they create. We all know Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, Dark Sun, Ravenloft, and all them. But what if you want to read some influences that that are not D&D worlds? Well, you go through Appendix N, and you read through that, and that just gives you an idea enough. It doesn't have to be a D&D world specifically. These books give you an idea of what type of adventures you can have in D&D, or any other tabletop games like OSR and Hyperborea or Black Sword Hack and all that, trying to capture the spirit of what that is. So if you're looking for copies of these paperbacks, they're not hard to find. You could go to any secondhand bookstore that's well stocked, you might be able to find them. Of course, you can go eBay or 8books and all that. If going on eBay alone, I would show you through a video, but my microphone's out, so I can only scroll through it silently. But just so you know, go to eBay, look up Kothar, Gardner F. Fox, and you can find any of the books of the Kothar series. Search around, you can find all 5 of them. I've seen them as high as $25, but don't worry about that. It doesn't. Just scroll down the next 1 or 2 and you'll find something below 10. So there's no reason to get any of these paperbacks for less than $10 each. But if you're not a stickler for old paperbacks, you just want a copy to read, Amazon does sell this as for physical copies of each of the books for $7.99 each. Again, look up Gardner F. Fox Kothar series. Do a quick look around. You can find it in paperback. You can also find it in, looks like audio and in Kindle form. So, unlike some fantasy books, old ones today that are, priced out the heck because these ones are still available. You can quickly get them on, without too much of a hassle of your wallet. Another point I want to make before I end this is how to think about this series is think about Conan the Barbarian, the early 80s movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Huge hit. And like the books, they had derivatives, of other movies as well. And not all of them were a good high budget. In fact, most of them were not. They're usually on the lower budget end. I guess the famous one is a Deathstalker series. In fact, some of them were so badly produced, it's hard to take them any form of serious immersiveness as you would from reading the books. There's the advantage here. These, you don't have to worry about bad production value. The theater of your mind is going to help you, get immersed with this. It is its own high production value on that. you can listen to the words of your mind, and it doesn't have to play badly acted lines. It doesn't have to you don't have to think cheap production sets. You can visualize that. So again, yes, this is not the top tier of the genre, but thankfully with your mind there you can make it a good production value and make it an enjoyable read. So there you go. Kothar series, 5 books here. I'll list them down below of each one. And by Gardner F. Fox. Thank you all for watching. Have a nice day.